the sale of humans is the second biggest revenue in our country. And I think that speaks volumes to how it's done. And you couldn't imagine that happening in our country without some familial attachments, right? Without families normalizing that it's okay and essentially being in a place where they pass down generations and generations and generations of interconnected violence, gender-based violence, and trafficking.
All right, so welcome to DAP's podcast. We're happy to be here today with Dr. Lori Quist from Breaking Free in celebration of Sexual Awareness Month. My name's Amirthini Keefe. I'm the Executive Director at the Domestic Abuse Project.
My name is Indigo. I use they, he pronouns, and I'm an advocacy case manager.
My name is Dr. Lori Quist. I'm the CEO at Breaking Free, and I use she, her pronouns.
All right, wonderful. If you could start by sharing a little bit more about Breaking Free, the services that you offer, and what it is that you all do.
Sure. Breaking Free has been around for almost 30 years. We're located in Ramsey County, and we provide a plethora of services to trafficking victims, specifically sex trafficking. However, we do work with labor trafficking as well, and sexual exploitation. We work with victims of domestic violence as well. There's a lot of crossover there, as you can imagine. We are the only housing provider in the state of Minnesota specific to trafficking victims. But we also provide advocacy. We have a full outreach team, and we have a safe harbor team.
Could you explain what safe harbor is?
Sure. Safe harbor is that population of persons that fall between the ages of 18 and 24 years old. They're really covered specifically under a different set of laws. So essentially, we're not going to convict somebody that's safe harbor age of trafficking, prostitution, any type of solicitation or any type of law that's connected to trafficking. We're going to protect that population. So there's a specific set of laws just for that age group. And so we have a team that supports that age group, finds them housing, advocates for them, empowers them.
Great, thanks.
So you mentioned too that there can be an overlap with your organization with DV and sex trafficking, and we see the same thing too with ours. So what are some of the overlaps and distinctions that you make between sex trafficking and domestic violence?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest one probably reigns true for you as well, but power and control. I mean, I think we're seeing, such a volume of force, fraud, and coercion, which are literally the three words in the federal definition of sex trafficking. But I think we see such a connection to power and control through the players. And when I say the players or the life, however you want to look at it, I think the difference between sex trafficking and domestic violence is that there's, in sex trafficking, typically a third party, right? There may be this commitment to love and life changes, and that's how somebody is potentially lured into this life, and they may become their intimate partner, and they may be even the victim or the survivor might even refer to them as their intimate partner. But we also see that person is manipulating them on a psychological level to have them essentially being treated or mistreated by a third party to, raise money, to gain drugs or a place to live. There's a plethora of things, but I think really, in all honesty, the parallels between the two are about violence, about the fact that, we have two prominent types of pimps, and we talk about them, Romeo pimps and guerrilla pimps. Guerrilla pimps really use a lot of force, but in some cases, our victims become very close and they feel that particular person is their intimate partner. Mm-hmm. They love them. Mm-hmm. So I think most of our clients would qualify for an order for protection or a restraining order. But I also think that when we add in that third element where we have somebody who is a purchaser of them, right, it takes that dynamic from intimate partner violence to a different level. And at that point, I also think that we're talking about law enforcement and community members and collaborators really differentiating between trafficking victims and domestic violence survivors and victims because we treat them different, right? And what's out there for them is really different. I think we have an automatic way to protect a victim. I mean, it's a piece of paper, and I understand that, right? With an OFP, but there isn't anything out there for somebody who's been trafficked. We can't get an OFP unless we prove that they've been a survivor of domestic violence as well. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of connections to domestic violence, and I think, we just see every case being really, really different, and every case having so many different elements that you're bound to run into a case where they will describe themselves as a survivor of sex trafficking, and we will say to them, you're also a survivor of domestic violence, right? Because all of the things have happened in the ways that we would assume they happen in domestic violence.
That's fascinating, though. So you can't get an OFP even though coercion is there, but because sex trafficking is also a piece of the story, it's difficult to get that OFP.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we look at funding in that light as well. We don't declare ourselves a domestic violence organization, right? Do we have the power to take somebody who has been the victim of domestic violence into court and get an OFP? Sure.
Right.
Could that person also be trafficked?
Yes.
Sure. But would we tell the court, we have a survivor of sex trafficking here trying to get an order for protection? No, we would say, we have somebody who's been involved in a domestic violence situation and they need to be protected. So there's a lot of language barriers there, right? There's a lot of things that we have to differentiate, which is really unfair to the victim / survivor because they're both. They could fit into both buckets, but more importantly, we shouldn't have to categorize their trauma to keep them safe.
Would you say that, or what would you say is some of the reason for having to categorize and maybe use different language? Or code switch in a way? Yeah,
I mean, well, personally, the code and the switching is something that we see a ton of. I think social media really kind of blows that up more than what we would see. But I mean, I do think that there are people that are learning those types of things. And but where I think the recognition is different is that our country as a whole has maybe started to embrace domestic violence survivors, learning that domestic violence can happen anywhere, right? And I think that there is still a strong stigma in our country that sex trafficking only happens in the bad parts of town. And it only happens to persons who want it to happen because they put themselves in a bad position. They walked on the street that they shouldn't have. They had a relationship with somebody that they shouldn't have. They allowed somebody to take them against their will, so to speak, where I think our country just isn't in a place where they are as accepting. And I don't think that they're really accepting of domestic violence, survivors either. So I think it's even more convoluted than what we see with domestic violence survivors.
No, for sure, because those same stigmas that come with, you chose to be in this relationship, why couldn't you leave? You have some control. We see in DV, but there's aspects of sex trafficking that really get stigmatized to make it so that it's different to people where you did something dirty.
Exactly.
Versus this thing might have just happen to you. So you don't get to have, levels of humanity, honestly, where this thing happened to you and you're still seen as someone that's deserving of support because you're a person.
Right.
And I think you're really onto something. I also think that when we look at this as a whole, some of the things that really strike me are what the expectation is of our community and what they expect from organizations such as ours in providing an education lens or a prevention lens and saying, well, how do we prevent this from happening when they're putting themselves in these positions? And we're constantly going back to the drawing board and saying, well, wait. They're not putting themselves in these positions. Yeah. This is circumstantial in some cases. This is familial in some cases. This has happened in their families. This has happened in their workplaces. This has happened because they were a runaway as a child or because they didn't have the means to go to the great schools or, they had to walk to the schools or whatever. But essentially, society has to stop blaming the victim for being in a position of poverty or homelessness or, any of those circumstances that lead our clients to where they are now. And I think it took our country many, many, many years to do that with domestic violence survivors. And my hope is that, it's done at some point with survivors of sex trafficking and exploitation.
So, Dr. Quist, you mentioned this when we were chatting a little earlier, and I feel like it's something that people don't talk about a lot, which is that sex trafficking can actually happen within family systems. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think familial trafficking is something that we don't talk about. It is not publicized. The media doesn't speak about it. It would be atrocious to think that a family would traffic their own, right? And in a lot of cases, familial trafficking could mean a couple of things. It could mean essentially that the trafficker has been a family member and is trafficking his family. It could also mean that a woman who was born into trafficking, was raised for trafficking specifically, has been sold through her family, and has children to be trafficked because that's all she knows. I would say that that's not just women, it's men as well. I think that we have a lot of men in our country who were born into being pimps or traffickers because that's what their dads did and that's what their grandfathers did, and that is the only way that they know how to make money. Not unlike drug traffickers in our country. One thing that's really interesting when I talk to big groups is I always tell them, what makes more money than almost anything in the world? And what's the first thing that makes money in our country? Like, what is the number one way to make money in our country? And everybody always says, drugs. And I always say, yes, drugs. What's the second? And they're like, I don't know. The second is humans. The sale of humans is the second biggest revenue in our country. And I think that speaks volumes to how it's done. And you couldn't imagine that happening in our country without some familial attachments, right? Without families normalizing that it's okay and essentially being in a place where they pass down generations and generations and generations of interconnected violence, gender-based violence, and trafficking.
Thank you. That really stood out to me when we were chatting earlier. So there's a lot of social media myths about how people get trafficked, such as signals that indicate that someone is being trafficked or the ways that people are marked as targets. Can you talk a little bit about how these myths get in the way of actually supporting survivors?
Yeah, I think it started back in the 1980s or early 90s with Pretty Woman. I'm not going to lie. That movie was extremely impactful to our country. It essentially every young girl in our country decided that they wanted to run off with Richard Gere, be a prostitute, and get on a white horse at the end of the movie. And that was their dream, right? And it normalized prostitution across the board. And instead of making people aware of how dangerous prostitution is and how dangerous trafficking is, we brought light to it and we made fun of it. And we showed that, Julia Roberts was this beautiful actress who ran off at the end of the movie with this gorgeous man, Richard Gere, and it'll all work out in the end. And in reality, we know that that's not the case, right? And the media, television shows, there's a movie out there, The Sound of Freedom. All of these things paint really small pictures of the problem. I think television does something for us that, it teaches people that it can only happen one way, and it's typically by force, and it's typically some fashion of kidnapping, elements of violence, which certainly can happen, but it isn't common. I think also when we're talking about safety mechanisms, there are a lot of different ways to create opportunities for prevention and intervention by education. Certainly movies like Pretty Woman, movies like Sound of Freedom, they don't necessarily tackle those obstacles, right? I do think that we have this kind of newfound freedom or exploration of posting things in like truck stop bathrooms and putting things on, airport walls and airport bathrooms to raise awareness, right? To say, hey, if this is happening to you, pick up the phone. I think the reality of that is that any survivor that's in a bathroom in an airport or a truck stop isn't going to have a phone, because that's all been taken away from them. They've been stripped of, anything that's identifiable. More than likely, their names have been changed. And them ever being alone and able to get a message to somebody for safety is slim and none. Even emergency rooms. When they walk into an emergency room with an injury from trafficking, typically the pimp is with them or the trafficker is with them. So unless you have a nurse that's really in tune to those signals that you speak about, it's just really, it's hype, in my opinion. So how do we find them and how do they come to us? I mean, typically it's through outreach efforts, right? Where they're homeless or on the streets, or it's word of mouth. We worked with a family member potentially and they know about us, right? So I think, that's a really complicated question because there are so many different stigmas out there around this and we look at it so differently. But I think the one takeaway I would put out there is just that what you see on TV is really not very accurate. It doesn't really mesh with what we see on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, like we really do get a lot of media messaging on what trafficking looks like and like what a victim survivor like even looks like, you know, like who's the one that you imagine when you think of that. And I'm curious how that impacts when you're working with victim survivors, how they're able to like talk about their experiences too, because they're also fed the same like media myths of like, you know, what being a survivor looks like, and what sex trafficking is. So when you're working with them, how much do you have to talk about like, all right, so this is what sex trafficking is, you know, and help them process their experience so that they're able to kind of come to those conclusions too?
Yeah, I think that's just a huge point for us. We have clients that come to us that have no idea that they've been trafficked. I mean, and I think that speaks to that familial trafficking we were talking about, because when you're born into, you know, a construction family, there's no need to go to college because you're going to do construction, right? And when you're born into a trafficking family, that's what's going to happen to you. You're going to be trafficked at some point. And it isn't going to be referred to as trafficking, right? This is just family business. This is what we do. So yeah, I think there are times when we ask a survivor to help us understand so that we can help them. We don't push to hear their stories, to be honest. There's a lot of re-traumatization with telling stories over and over and over again. You know, there's been a large push to have, I think, just persons that have been survivors of sex trafficking go into community dialogues and speak about their truths and talk about their experiences. And what we find is that a lot of times they are really re-triggered from that. They are re-traumatized, and it takes a long time for them to recover from telling that story over and over again. I think the other thing that it really rings true with all trafficking survivors, anybody that's had that level of trauma, is that the details aren't as straightforward as what you would think, and they come out as time goes on because they're healing and they're remembering things. So we try really hard not to push. Obviously, we have a criteria they have to meet to live in our housing. We don't have a criteria they have to meet to be believed, right? So we just break it down as simply as possible, and we tell them right off the bat, we believe you, we want to help you, we want to walk alongside you in your journey. And you are a survivor. And I think even that can be troublesome at times for persons who don't know that they've been trafficked, because they'll say, well, what am I a survivor of? You know, this is where I was supposed to be. It's supposed to be this way. I deserve this, right? So yeah, I think we see that a lot. It's probably the hardest part of my job, really, to be honest, is to meet somebody who has been, horrifically handled and treated and mistreated, and violated and raped and sexually violated over and over and over again in their lives, and they don't connect that they're a victim. I think it's really tough to be in that scenario.
I think it's a really powerful thing that you said of the criteria for the housing, but there's no criteria for being believed. And I think that it's so interesting because we were talking about maneuvering systems and like the OFPs earlier, and it really is a traumatizing process to have to write out those details, know that the process, you know, you might have to go in front of a judge and talk more about this. And it's something that we really talk about in our work in advocacy too, where we're going to try to prepare you for what this OFP process looks like. But between you and me, I understand what you're going through, and I understand that this process is really difficult. So I think in both of our work, it's really important to just be with someone and let them process what's going on too, and kind of walking next to them as a support system.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the connection to celebrations, food, right? I'm constantly saying when I meet with community members and they're saying, well, what do we do if we encounter a victim? How do we start a conversation? And I always say, you know, don't you want to start your conversation with a cup of coffee, maybe a warm meal, something to eat? You know, do you have microwavable mac and cheese in your desk. Could you throw in a cup of mac and cheese, and could you give them a cup of coffee, or could you get them a can of pop from the vending machine, or but does it have to be so formalized that we re-traumatize immediately out of the gate, right? How about just let's have a conversation. Good morning. How about, may I speak to you about your experience? Ask permission instead of being in a place where we assume that they want to talk to us. Maybe it's just that they want a safe space to be not bothered and not, feeling like everything is ending in one moment. Sometimes I think we forget that we're dealing with people that are just humans just like us. And sometimes they just want to be recognized as a mom or a sister, and that is so heavy all the time that sometimes we have to start with something else. I like that you connected the parallels. I really think that's important for your work and our work.
No, for sure. And I'm hearing that too, when you're kind of behind the desk and you're in the system in a way, it can be really hard to kind of have somebody come up and then have to bear their experiences and be vulnerable and ask for support. You might have to detail what happened to you, and you have to ask for something. So I was wondering too, like you spoke to a little bit just now too on the process of like humanizing someone and getting to know them, but how do y'all maneuver the distrust that can happen even being in the system, even though you're there to support them? In a way, you're still having to maneuver, like maybe like law enforcement, like housing systems, all these things.
Yeah, I'm really excited you asked the question. So I wrote my dissertation on this. My dissertation was about, how law enforcement sees or how they have the ability to change essentially this work. And I think through some of that, through that lens, and also being the CEO at Breaking Free, we have had to do a lot of teaching, to do a lot of mentoring, because I think there is an expectation that law enforcement will fix everything, and there's an expectation that law enforcement is bad. And it is our job as a provider and our job as persons that care for people that have been trafficked, to educate and to connect those dots and to collaborate, right? So I think in a lot of cases for us, it's about inviting a law enforcement officer into an event and asking them not to wear their uniform, right? Or saying, could you introduce yourself as John instead of detective? It's about helping them understand that those conversations can happen with a third party in the room to support them, but they have to happen, because if they don't happen, we can't protect them. Like we talked about earlier, we can't go to court and get a magic piece of paper that says the trafficker will stay away. But we can make a connection with law enforcement and say, we have a victim out of Ramsey County who has been trafficked, and here's the trafficker's information. We have to do something to get this person off the streets, right? There is an expectation that they be responsive in the moment. And I think that sometimes we put probably too much on their plates and saying that, because they can't change the world either, and we've proven that. I also think that they have to be person-centered. They have to be their best selves all the time, and we expect that. We expect them to be our partners in the work the minute we call them. We expect them to show up the minute we ask. And when they do, and they drop everything and they come, and some of our survivors, they get there and they're all ready to talk to them, they walk in the door and our survivors are like, no, I can't do this. That's okay. And we will tell them all, like, it's okay. We'll start over tomorrow, right? And that frustrates law enforcement because they're busy. That frustrates the advocates because they're busy. It frustrates, the victim/survivor because they wanted it done, but they just couldn't do it. So I think we have to get to a place in this work where, number one, we don't demand so much. We just understand better. And we love more than we don't. We care more than we don't. I think sometimes this is about saying to a law enforcement officer, I'm deeply touched by this situation, and I know you will be too, and I really want you to walk alongside me with this person because I know you could bring some good to this situation, instead of do your job. Because I think sometimes they're not sure what to do either, and they don't want to cause more harm. In my dissertation, that was really, it rang true a lot. I interviewed multiple people, and they repeated themselves over and over and over again. Sometimes we feel like we're doing harm and we don't want to do harm and we're afraid. Well, who wants to think of law enforcement as afraid, right? And so we share that with our survivors because we help them understand that, this is a two-way street. There has to be cooperation from both sides, and we have to collaborate in the middle. And that's really how we have tackled some of that. We have a long way to go, right? I don't know that this is ever going to be perfect, but I do think that both sides are moving towards the middle at a snail's pace, but it's happening. So that's all I could ask for.
I feel like your statement moves really well into the last question that we had on our list, which is on your website, the message that you have is empowering hope, combating sex trafficking and homelessness. Why do you think the idea of hope is so important in your work?
I think that this life creates a breakdown of all things human and humanity. I think it takes a person's soul away. I think that persons that have been sold and bought and raped in modern day slavery situations, they don't value themselves anymore. They can't find value. They have lost themselves a lot of times in this work. And so when we connect hope to resiliency or any principles that would bring a ray of light, that is huge for our clients, for our staff, for our country, right? Because if we can show one case where they overcame those details and they were able to put the right foot in front of the left every day. And so I think, for me, I think when we look at somebody who came into our organization beaten and battered and like I said, raped and held hostage in some cases, or just mistreated or starved, and 8-10 months down the road, they have hope of going back to college, or they have hope of, getting their children back, or, just being in a normal, quote unquote, air quote, normal situation again. You hang on to that, right? You love it. You nurture it. You're like, they have hope for the first time in a really long time. And this is going to change their lives. And it takes a long time to find the hope for them, So yeah, I don't know. Hope is a huge thing for me. It's one of my favorite words because as soon as they have a piece of that, it doesn't have to be the whole thing. Just a small crumble of hope, a crumb. We see big change in them,
That's beautiful. And I think tied to that, you highlighted something, Indigo, that Lori said around not having criteria for believing the folks that you work with. And I think that really also highlights the importance of having community-based organizations like yours that can hang on to that hope, help build hope within the population that you're serving, and how it's different than systems that do have criteria for believing folks in order to provide some of those protections. And that's just the way that some systems are built. And we both know that federal funding is something that is currently threatening the existence of several community-based organizations. Do you want to share a little bit about what that means for Breaking Free?
Sure.
And what the community can do to support you?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. Of course, we have this motto at Breaking Free: don't meet crisis with crisis, right? I'm sure you do too. Take a big deep breath when crisis happens, right? And I feel like right now we are faced with a substantial crisis. I think the mere fact that our federal funding is being threatened, which supports all of our survivors who are housed with us. Currently, we have the availability to support or capacity to support over 60 families. So I think that's a lot of families. And we essentially get a subsidy from a federal source, which is HUD. And without that federal funding, we would lose that housing for our clients. We also fund, our advocates, our housing manager, our whole housing team is funded out of federal funding. Supports administrative functions. It supports a ton of things. So without that funding, which is about 55% of our general budget, our whole operating budget, we look like a very different organization, and we're not able to provide those services. I constantly tell people, if you tell one person a day about sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, somebody who just didn't understand or didn't know, that person tells another person, and another person tells another person. Awareness will reach the White House lawn, right? It has to. We're holding out hope that, the country will shift and that this won't be a thing. But in our case, it's catastrophic. If it does happen and they pull back funding, an immense number of persons housed with us will lose their housing.
Any call to action for the community?
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at our website, we just rolled out a really great initiative. We are rebranding, and it's going to be amazing. We've got a new logo that we're unveiling. We've got a new website we're unveiling. And the whole month of April, around Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we're doing a fundraising campaign to try to recoup some of those dollars, recuperate some of those dollars, and essentially bring awareness into the families that don't know about us, and hopefully bring some new donors to the organization and supporters. And donorship looks like volunteers. It looks like persons bringing in things for our clients, such as food and basic needs and hygiene and all of those things. So lots of different ways to help, and I'd love to talk to anybody about that.
Awesome. And your website is breakingfree.net.
Well, it is for the moment. It's actually changing to breakingfreemn.org. And if you got my latest round of emails, it's now coming from our .org. So I will send you an email with our new .org email, so
Wonderful.
You have it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here and joining us. It was
Thank you
great
for
to have
having
you.
me.
Learned a lot of new things today, and it was really great conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming and talking about this. I think it's really important to have these conversations and get more people on board with the programs that we're doing, then talk more about like stigma and judgment too. So thank you for your honesty and talking about this.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.